Okay, I think we should probably go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us for this panel entitled The EU-China-Russia Nexus, Confrontation or Cooperation. I'm going to be chairing this panel. My name is Paul Goode. I'm the Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies here at Carleton University. And we have a distinguished panel of experts. Balkan Devlin, unfortunately, is unable to join us today because he has fallen ill. His loss is our presenter's gain, insofar as there's a little bit more time for presentations and for discussion. So I think we will go otherwise in the order that's listed on the program, starting with Professor Piotr Dukevich. Piotr, I think, probably needs no introduction for many of the people here. Professor Dukevich is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Governance and Public Policy here at Carleton University. He was editor-in-chief of a 19-volume series on local and regional development in Poland from 1986 to 1989, and editor or co-editor and contributor to 12 other books. The title of his presentation today is Unavoidable Friendship, Notes on Russia-China Relations.
Thank you. I'm grateful for this invitation. Thank you. First, a disclaimer. I am neither Chinese speaker nor a student of Russian politics. But I know a bit about Russian politics and acquainted with the key Russian experts on China. So what I have done for this presentation was to select 5 most prominent experts on China in Russia, and then follow what they have written about China during the last year and a half, 2 years from now, in Russian language, sometimes in the obscure journals, in the editing of copies of 100 and 200 copies. So, and I group those views in 4 areas: performative, material, discursive, and institutional practices. So after that exercise, which took me a while, I visualize Russian-Chinese relations as a bundle of closely amalgamated economic, political, geostrategic, geosecurity, and historical components. And it's rather hard to unbundle them and present them in the more or less compartmental fragments without certain simplification. So forgive me for those simplifications by unbundling these relations. So let me start from the performative practices. And in summary, as I will start always in my presentation with a very short summary of what I'm going to say, these performative practices, they are largely symbolic, but creating a publicly visible frame of mutual respect and support. This is apparently very important for Russians. That, during the visit of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Li, he said, "Friendship forever, friends forever, never enemies." And it was quoted and requoted in the main news media many times. But words are easy to say. But at the same time, Russian scholars acknowledged and pay a lot of attention to the formal and protocolar acknowledgements of Russia's great power status by Chinese visitors and Chinese scholars. It is highly praised in Russia, particularly on the backdrop of treatment of Russia and Russian officials by the West-North leaders. And there are multiple examples of such a special treatment: public expression of admiration to Putin, special attention in China media to Putin and his entourage, highest protocol treatment of Putin during his visit in China. I have noted that one of the articles was fully devoted to the treatment of latest Putin visit in China, and all details will specify in which the Chinese honored Russian president as a proof that Russia is respected in China. Also, every Russian region, city, and university has now the so-called permanent sister relation with the counterpart in Russia. And there are so-called China rooms in many schools to show the closeness between Russian and Chinese people. Russian experts pointed also that such practices quite successfully boost Russian pride, and they have a very positive effect on popular perception of China in Russia. And these practices, by the end of the day, they put China as the friendliest country in Russia for the last 4 consecutive years. And the formal show of respect resonate very well in this sense among Russian public. Let me turn you to the material practices. And in summary, China supports trade and investment at a level that keeps some areas of Russian production and commodity supply stable under extensive sanction regime. This is the leitmotif of every expert account of those economic relations. Trade grew up, then they are very happy with this, reaching the level of $225 billion last year. Not bad. But also, Russian experts regularly admit existing trade imbalances and growing Russian dependence on China. But at the same time saying that China has rescued some sectors of Russian industry and provided Russia with otherwise unavailable, because of sanction, commodities. Among these special privileges that Chinese received in the economic area, Russia and China watchers agree that Russia granted Chinese investors unprecedented access, quote unquote, unprecedented access to the energy sector and auto industry sector that was down by 70%. So there is a recognition that China, during the last 3 years, de facto monopolized auto sector in Russia. In exchange, Russia provided China with a food supply from the list of the so-called strategic food security list, which was very appreciated by China. At the same time, most of the Russian experts agree that quote, investment cooperation remains a weak point in Russia-Chinese economic cooperation. Its level does not yet meet the Russian expectation, end of the quote. And also an expert from the Sberbank admits, quote, that in analyzing why this is the case, there is not a fault of Chinese, but rather, quote, insufficient level of protection of property rights, the complexity of procedures for accessing financial services, the Russian ineffectiveness of law enforcement agencies and bureaucracies. And Russian experts from Sberbank concluded that obviously those areas of limitations are hard to change fast in the Russian context. Another feature of economic relations frequently mentioned is China's reluctance in participation in Russia-led multilateral cooperation projects, such as projects related to Eurasian Economic Union, and at the same time, Russia's very slow response to Chinese-led BRI initiatives. Today, the only major project completed within the framework of BRI can be conditionally considered the Power of Siberia gas pipeline. Otherwise, there are no successes in this area between China and Russia. Let me turn to the third point, which is discursive practices. In summary, seemed that at operational level, unlike at high political level, Russia finds increasingly harder to maintain friendly and pragmatic discourse with her Chinese counterparts. Surprisingly, but that's the effect of what I have gathered. Russian experts note that China and Russia similarly define their foes, and that both leaders are mentally close to each other in the assessment of the world affairs. However, at the lower level, there are two issues to watch according to Russian policy advisors. First is that China's geopolitical aspirations are going in different directions than Russia. Russia is just a strategic rare for China, not a potential rival. But also Russia is not a partner in active support of the Chinese aspiration in the South. End of quote. Second is that most prominent experts agree or put it, quote, the new self-confident style of Chinese diplomacy is beginning to spread to Russia. Chinese diplomats often speak rudely. This is the direct quote. Speak rudely, given instructions to Russian scientists and journalists on what and how they should say and write about China. Chinese students disrupt classes if their classmates from other countries say something wrong about China. And, which is interesting and surprising, another quote, recently we have seen, writes a well-known sinologist, the phenomenon of Chinese terminology penetrating bilateral official Russian documents. For instance, that was one example, Russia has adopted Chinese concept of community of common destiny in the foreign affairs ministry documents. Russian experts also admit that, quote, a significant obstacle to further rapprochement may be the lack of trust caused by the change in the style of Chinese foreign policy. Russian experts recently observed, quote, Chinese citizens, employees of various foreign institutions, teachers, professors, and students of Russian universities are used to impose the Chinese point of view on various historical and international issues. And this is often done in extremely active form, which leads to disruption of classes and goes beyond the framework of friendly relations. Quote, end of the quote. Another quote from Higher School of Economics, the leading academic institution in Russia. Quote, a few Russian universities have already refused to invite Chinese teachers for permanent position and are reducing the number of Chinese students for this reason. End of the quote. Russia is also, like other countries, trying to restrain the spread of the Confucius Institutes and renegotiating the number of these Confucius Institutes in Russia. Also, Chinese experts complain that Russian television companies are not including in China Russian TV companies and is not showing the key propagandist channels like Channel 1 in China that is only available in the large chain of hotels. And here is another interesting point. For me, it was a bit shocking. In addition, and that is one of the experts from Higher School of Economics, quote, in China, monuments to Russian soldiers who liberated the northeast of the country from Japanese in 1945 are moved from city centers to suburbs and deserted places, even much more than this is the case of Eastern Europe. And the explanation why it's long and convoluted from the Chinese side. But they calculated that even by the Eastern European standards that we usually do that China is exceeding the norm. Very well. We're moving to the last, institutional practices. In summary, Russian experts' assessment notes that a vigorous and multifaceted institutional cooperation between China and Russia is clouded by China's reserved approach to multilateral cooperation under Russian leadership, such as Eurasian Economic Union. On the other side, Eurasian Economic Union under Russian leadership is reluctant participant in Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Quote, relations between EA, EU, and China are built on a non-preferential basis, which was formalized and confirmed by the agreement in 2018 on the development of trade and economic cooperation between the Eurasian Economic Union and China. For Russia, as most of our experts believe, the creation of the free trade zone between EU and China is still a very premature step. This is a quote, is still a very premature step in the context of China's economic domination in the region. Otherwise, Russia experts underline that Russia and China have developed satisfactory infrastructure for mutually beneficial institutional infrastructure for mutually beneficial and smooth institutional cooperation, from annual meetings or summits between senior leaders to numerous intergovernmental commissions, such as, for instance, and this is repeating, the Intergovernmental Russian-Chinese Commission for Investment Cooperation, which is the only institutional link in the area of market relations formally agreed between Putin and Xi Jinping. Almost all Russian scholars agree that, institutionally speaking, Russia is incompatible with China. And they are quoting different relations between center and periphery, local authorities and central authorities. We can come back to this in discussion. I am excluding military cooperation because this is the purpose for another analysis. In conclusion, this presentation suggests that the advantages of having China as partner are obvious for Russia, but there are limitations. Let me conclude with another quote from one of the key Russian experts on China. Quote, rapprochement with China, which has become a reality and one of the main trends in Russian foreign policy, brings both obvious advantages and certain challenges to Russia. Now important. Moscow is unlikely to agree to even closer relations with Beijing. China does not need it either, since the tendency towards self-confidence contradicts the idea of tying oneself to formal obligation that can limit sovereignty and freedom of action for both. Therefore, it's very likely that the peak of Russian and Chinese rapprochement has already passed. In the future, both sides will show, from now on, more pragmatism in practice. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor Gene Wilson. Professor Wilson is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and the former Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of Russian Studies at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. She is a research associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and her research interests are largely concentrated on comparing Russian and Chinese foreign policy goals, including with respect to their position as outliers in the international system. Professor Wilson's talk today will be entitled Russian-Chinese Relations, just checking to make sure it hasn't changed, and their relevance for the European Union.
Thank you. I thought the morning talks were really interesting, the panels, and it was also very interesting to me because they were so specialized. And I should warn you that I'm engaging in wild speculation along geopolitical lines. And I have a feeling you can probably poke quite a few holes in some of these assertions. Although I would like to say that I think that my assertions might also be rooted in what people say and not what people do when we're talking about the Russian, the Chinese leadership. But I want to talk, excuse me, I'm going to talk about Chinese-Russian relations. And so what I want to do is I want to start out and talk about what I considered are 6 important, but probably not exclusive, underlying facets of the relationship. And that's this first part of my talk. And the second part of my talk, I want to talk about what this might mean for the EU and why it's relevant for the EU in some form or other. I should also note that I'm really clueless with PowerPoint, so let's hope for the best. I'm not going to talk about these now, and I hopefully will not go over my 15-minute limit either, although I guess we've been given a bit of a reprieve. But these are my points, but I'll bring them up in the context of the conversation. Number one, and probably some of these everybody in the room already knows, but there's a growing asymmetry in the Sino-Russian relationship, and of course it indicates the increasing disparity in material power capabilities between the two states. I would argue, and in a way it's a little bit related to what Piotr is saying and what he had to say about what the Russian specialists are saying, that more recently, China has emerged as the dominant voice in the relationship. It is more and more setting the parameters. And you can see that in the joint statements that are released by the two states after their yearly visits. There's a lot of Chinese phrasing that creeps their way into them. Chinese GDP in 2023, according to IMF figures, is almost 9 times greater than that of Russia. Thirdly, the Russian-Ukrainian war has increased Russia's economic dependence on China. China is Russia's largest trade partner and has been for a while, predating Ukraine. And it also now is serving as a vital lifeline for products that are no longer supplied by Europe, as well, and we'll get into this a little more later, to dual-use technologies that sustain the war effort. Secondly, the fundamental bond that connects China and Russia is their joint opposition to Western hegemony and the norms and values of the Western liberal order. Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure there are norms and values of the Western liberal order in liberal, they might be under reconstruction, but I think this has been the primary basis of solidarity, in my view, between Russia and China. And I have here some quotes by Putin and by several by Putin and one by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They're really on the same page with this. Historically, China was much more critical of the West and the United States behind closed doors, in internal documents, but this U.S. hegemony and its perils was released by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2023. And yes, and so, and I would also say that Putin, since the invasion of Ukraine, has become increasingly negative in his sorts of statements about the West, which are almost unremittingly hostile. Third, I would say that China and Russia have partially convergent views as to the goal of the establishment of a multipolar world, which is and remains a staple of Sino-Russian joint statements. I argue that for Russia, a multipolar world is a way for Russia to remain relevant. It represents a pole within a multipolar world. And also, talking about Ukraine a little bit later, too, I think it's important. Multipolarity for Russia is also intimately tied with its exercising a sphere of influence over the post-Soviet space. But multipolarity is also a means of Russia maintaining its status as a great power, and that's important as a pillar of regime legitimacy as well. Now, China has a much more transactional and selective approach to the notion of polarity, which is to say that they use it when it suits their interest. And here it's interesting. when they talk to the EU, they talk in terms of multipolarity, that they're both poles in the multipolar world. When China directs its attention to the global south, it rarely speaks of multipolarity. It speaks of this concept, which has already been introduced already, the community with a shared future for mankind, or I think I noticed it was also noted as the community of common destiny. But this concept, I think, is very Sinocentric, and I don't think it has much for Russia in it. And I would say that Russia is not very enthusiastic about this construct, which, although the construct's been around, well, it's been around for a long time. It actually wasn't even introduced by Xi Jinping. It was actually first used by Hu Jintao, his predecessor, but he had a different statement. But it wasn't included in Sino-Russian joint statements until 2021, and at that point, it was introduced as the Chinese concept of the community of common destiny, while the Chinese side acknowledged the Russian notion of multipolarity, which I thought also was significant in my mind. Here's where I think the Chinese and the Russians have the greatest point of differentiation, and that is in their positions on globalization and the role of the Bretton Woods financial institutions. The Chinese government is a passionate advocate of globalization. I don't think you can find anyone, any global leading state more in tune with globalization. I know free trade, I don't know that China's government's actually really in free trade, but we'll leave that aside. At least they talk about it all the time. And here's this, I would say, reformist, I would say, in its view of the global financial institutions seeking to enlarge China's voice in these bodies. But you have all kinds of quotes by the Chinese about how globalization is great. However, Russia is much less enthusiastic about globalization, and I think they've become increasingly hostile to the concept in recent years. If you went back and you read the 2008 Russian foreign policy document, they actually express a skepticism even back in 2008. But now, what I also didn't know until recently when I started to look at it more closely is that the Russians are drawing upon a Marxist-Leninist assessment that is actually Leninist in its interpretation of the theory of imperialism and colonial exploitation, transmission of excess surplus profits back to the metropole, et cetera, et cetera. And you can find these comments through the speeches of Putin, interestingly, and also Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, echoes those in some of his own statements. So I would say that the two states have contrasting views on international order and stability as systemic goals, too. For decades, the Chinese have been married to the concept of the maintenance of order and stability as a prerequisite for economic development. And I think Putin himself has revealed himself as a risk taker, who occasionally doesn't seem to be too worried about blowing up the system if it suits his interest. And I think the Kremlin's not necessarily adverse to destabilizing measures in the international system. And one example of this is the rather cavalier discussions by Russian political elites, including the former President Dmitry Medvedev, about making use of tactical nuclear weapons in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Now, that might be a bit of a bluff, but the very fact that that narrative is taking place is rather alarming. 6, I wrote this as a question, but do China and Russia coordinate their foreign policy decisions, which in a way is how close is this relationship? And one answer to that is I don't know. Decision-making in both states is something of a black box, and decision-making between the two of them is also a kind of a black box. They do regularly assert that they coordinate their foreign policy. The 2024 joint statement refers to their relationship as a, quote, joint statement on deepening the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. Every year, the statements get longer and longer. And they do consult periodically and have discussions that seem to be oriented toward international issues. I mean, I think after she, I can't remember, I think it was Putin spoke to Trump first. I can't remember which, or Xi Jinping. I think after the first one of them spoke to Trump, the other one got on the phone apparently and called each other and seemed to have related whatever happened there. I get the feeling that they do collaborate on international issues. However, I don't see any indication really that they coordinate their foreign policy on regional issues, despite saying that they do so. And so that brings me to the end of the first part of my presentation, and now I want to talk a little bit about the EU. And I'll skip over some of this because because it's already been discussed this morning extensively, so I won't go into it. But I think the most important point is that I see no indication that China and Russia make any effort to coordinate their relations with the EU. And there's a simple reason why they don't. They have different views on it. I think they have very different perspectives on how they observe the EU. China's not negative toward the EU as an institutional entity. But Russia at this point is almost unremittingly hostile toward the EU. This is just some things that have already been discussed about China and the EU from the EU side. This has been discussed somewhat too, but I want to maybe mention it a little bit from the Chinese side. And I would like to talk a little bit about the geopolitical component to China's EU strategy, because it gets into the discussion that has already been raised in the morning panels, is does China seek to draw a wedge between the United States and the EU, and the EU? And I don't, I think the interesting question is whether or not that actually can take place, given the economic dimensions of it, which I can't really speak to, but I can speak to the rhetoric. And the rhetoric of China toward the EU is very much, we're a pole in a multipolar world, you're a pole in the multipolar world, we should communicate, we should cooperate, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, when Xi went to Europe in 2024, he talked of the China and the EU as two major forces advancing multipolarity, two major markets in support of globalization, there's that, and two major civilizations championing diversity. In February, Wang Yi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, at the Munich Security Conference argued that Europe was an important pole in the multipolar world and that the two sides were partners, not rivals. And that's interesting in light of the fact that the EU labeled China as a systemic rival in 2019, and he's obviously implicitly referring to that. Okay, from the Russian side, we haven't really talked about this yet, as I don't know that we need to talk too much. I think everybody knows that the EU sees the Ukrainian invasion as a direct threat to Europe's security. It's been labeled a key strategic challenge in 2016, a long-term and direct threat for European security in 2022, and the EU has instituted 16 sanctions packages against Russia, and they're on the path of creating their 17th one. My take on Russia and the EU from the Russian side is, well, one thing, Russian attitudes from the EU toward the EU have evolved over the past 25 years or so. Originally, with a little bit of flirtation in the 1990s, Russian attitudes toward NATO have been hostile. But there used to be a differentiation made between the EU and NATO. And and NATO was considered somewhat benign. That no longer is the case. And I think it's partly due, or it's largely due, to the fact that that the EU is encroaching on a Russian sphere of influence in its outreach projects to engage Eastern European states, and then Russia for that matter, with the EU. And also we haven't been mentioned, Piotr mentioned it, the EU is of course further seen as a competitor to the Russian-dominated Eurasian Economic Union. So here is the key dates in the evolution of Russian-EU relations, but what I think is interesting here is, well, 2 points really. When the European Union launched their European neighborhood policy, they invited Russia to participate. And Russia said no. And their logic was that the European neighbor policy was, partnership was being offered to places like Moldova and Armenia and Morocco, and that was an insult to Russia's status as a great power. So eventually the Europeans were conciliatory, and they formalized the so-called four common spaces. I think that says something there about the Russian attitudes, but also, of course, in 2013, the Ukrainians were set to agree to sign a deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement with the EU. I think Russian pressure forced Yanukovych, or compelled Yanukovych, to break that off, and that led to this. I wouldn't say that the Russian-Ukrainian relations, the discord began in 2013, but it set in stage another scenario there. Okay, so just to sum up, I think China has no ideological objections to the EU, which is not the case with Russia. I think I would also argue that China does seek to divide the EU from the U.S. But the Russian focus, I think that from the Russian point of view, the EU is such a Slavish subordinate of the United States. It's hopeless. But the Russian focus has been on cultivating individual states, Hungary, Serbia, etc. Although China does this too, to a certain extent. So, okay. Do I have enough time left here to talk about? Briefly, the Russian-Ukrainian war. China has assumed a position of neutrality in the war. It actually has not acknowledged or recognized the annexation of Crimea, nor the Russia 2022 annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia into Russia. It has no serious objection to the existence of Ukraine as a state. It actually has a strategic partnership with Ukraine, but that was concluded during Yanukovych, so maybe it doesn't count. And it's often not known that China is Ukraine's largest trade partner, if you take away the EU. The Russian invasion seems to have taken the Chinese by surprise, but the Chinese official narrative on the war is not substantially different from the Russian narrative on the war. And as I alluded to before, China is a critical lifeline to Russia, providing economic support and dual-use technologies. In the NATO words, China is a decisive enabler. China does have some diplomatic undertakings that they seek a resolution to the war. There's no evidence that they've actually attempted to convince Russia to end the war. They are not happy with the Russian loose talk of using nuclear weapons in the war, and they have apparently expressed their displeasure to the leadership. Okay, so this is my last point, and I really have no answers to this. But it certainly is in turn keeping with the rest of the conversation. What are the prospects for a negotiated end to the Russian-Ukrainian war? I think it's, does the Trump administration seek to split Russia from China? I think they are. I think that is a goal. How likely is that scenario? If you read almost every commentator, they will say that they don't think it's likely. I'm persuaded myself that it's not really likely, but you know what? It's really hard to say never on April 15th, 2025. So there we are. When the news changes every 2 hours or so, why not? But regarding the U.S.-China and then what it has to say about the EU, I feel slightly more confident about this, but I don't know how the other people in the room feel that really study tariffs and EU and Chinese relations much more extensively than I do. I don't think that the Chinese will cave into Trump's tariff demands. And here, just the other day, in the words of Xi, China and the EU must jointly oppose unilateral acts of bullying. So on that note, I will end. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker for the panel today is Una Berzhina-Cherenkova. Professor Berzhina-Cherenkova is a China scholar and discourse analyst. She has held research fellowships at Fudan, Stanford, Oxford, and Hokkaido universities, and is affiliated currently with King's College London and Merix. What does Merix stand for?
You don't know what Merix is. Merix is the leading European think tank on China.
Thank you.
Based in Berlin, of course.
She is also the author of Imperfect Balance, China and Russia, which is published by World Scientific in 2022, and editor of Discourse, Rhetoric, and Shifting Political Behavior in China, published by Routledge in 2023. Professor Berzhina-Cherenkova's talk today is entitled Russia-China Ideological Alignment Following the Full-Scale Invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you. And my presentation will be slotted into Piotr's third category, discursive practices, and will specifically discuss something that Jane also mentioned, how the Chinese phrasing has penetrated some of Russia's strategic documents. So the question that I tried to tackle here with this paper was, is there proof and is there some sort of a timeline that we can build in terms of how Chinese visions of international order have been adopted or have penetrated Russian documents? And the instinctive timeline, of course, is not just because I'm from the Baltics, but in general, it feels that the instinctive timeline, of course, is February 24, 2022. That was something that needed to be tested because it could be a coincidence. But in fact, just recently, Professor Khrushcheva's article came out where she writes that she sort of provides her own analysis that, in fact, the quote-unquote special military operation in Ukraine began. There was a different kind of hard propaganda push, and there has been a change in the information environment. So it is a valid timeline to capture a change in the way things are being said, domestically, yes, but also internationally. Debatable, but and then of course there are two caveats, and also we use the word caveat here. It's basically a challenge that we can't overcome yet. But obviously, first of all, what is ideological alignment anyway? Is cheating a push to change the international order? Is quoting someone ideologically aligning? It remains. But I'm going to stick with what some of my colleagues have said, is that if it kind of feels ideological, there must be something there. So that's the assumption. And the other thing, of course, is the causality trap. Even if the timeline matches, is this really the cause of changing, of introducing some of China's Xi speak into Russia's strategic documents? So I will not be arguing causality here, just outlining the timeline. So when we talk about Chinese ideology, we've broken so many swords over this. I remember Professor Carrie Brown and we published an article a decade ago on China's ideology under Xi Jinping. Oh my God, we got so much feedback and pushback saying that this is really not ideology. And fair, right? So I guess it's a matter of taste. But if we look at it today, it's actually more pronounced than it was 10 years ago. And we can see that there have been 3 particular initiatives that have been put forward by the Chinese government that sort of give you a bit of a normative taste of how things should be in development, how things should work globally in security, and what does the world really consist of? Does it consist of individuals? No, it consists of civilizations. So the first one was the GDI, which is arguably the least contested. It's been already incorporated into many UN documents, and it focuses on sustainable development, which also means don't necessarily follow the Western playbook. And of course, it talks about goals that align with the UN agenda for sustainable development, and the goals very nicely, including poverty alleviation. So that's been really prominent already. So you can make a point that has already been normalized and internalized in the international system. Now, the second one is the Global Security Initiative, or GSI. It has 2 things about it that are interesting. First of all, of course, to echo Jane here, that it aims to challenge the dominance of Western powers. It speaks about the hegemony of global security, about how it's not working. But another thing that Professor Rosemary Foote, a UN scholar and somebody who probably many of you know from her work at Oxford, also writes in a recent edited volume, is that it is about bringing state security back. We've had the Kofi Annan phenomenon where, human security was centralized. Well, no more of that. It's about states, state security, not individual security. And the third one is a very tricky and interesting one, is the Global Civilization Initiative. And that came out in 2023. And I think the first time it's been introduced was when Xi Jinping spoke at an international party conference. So the CCP invites political parties from different regions of the world. And then that's where he spoke about the civilizations. Basically, it's about saying, you do you. If we paraphrase Isaiah Berlin, who used to say that it doesn't really, cultural relativism doesn't work because it's not an argument. I take my coffee with milk and you like mass genocide. It's not comparable. There are things where we draw a line. And here it kind of goes back to that cultural relativism that Berlin pushed against. And it says, yes, in my culture, maybe certain social norms are not okay, but if that's okay with the Taliban, then, it's their civilization. And now, what are the joint goals of these 3 initiatives are, first of all, critique against the liberal world order, support non-liberal governance models, not in the sense that, if you're a non-liberal model, we're going to throw money your way, but in a way that, non-liberal governments can also be effective in delivering on these goods, development, security. So why shouldn't they? It's better than the alternative, which is illiberal and undeveloped and not safe. Then deepen ideological alignment among the UN and compete against the US, of course. So what could Russia's interest be then to include these formulas in the documents? Well, of course, with the Global Development Initiative, and Lavrov always points out, and also Russia's contingent at the UN always points out that we were one of the first to join the group of friends of the Global Development Initiative in 2021, that the West is not the answer for the neighborhood, for the Russian neighborhood. And I guess we see that playing out in the region, also in the Ukrainian context, but also in even in the Romanian election context. Now, the support that Russia provides is there are third regions where there are joint efforts to challenge Western influence and development. But like I say, GDI is not even the most interesting one, so let's move on. Now GSI. Obviously, it coincides with the Russian interest to promote a multipolar world. It's like we rehearsed this with Jane, in which non-democratic powers have a bigger role in the global security. So what this document contains is a very tricky phrase, which is called legitimate security concerns. So China says, basically, if big countries are pushed to the wall, they have legitimate security concerns, then no wonder that things are going to blow. So in one way, they're neutral about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but on the other hand, they provide this new, which is not, of course, legally binding in any way. It doesn't appear in any international law. There is no such thing as legitimate security concerns in international law. However, these countries have legitimate security concerns, so they, finish the sentence, attack their neighbor or whatever. And so Russia likes that. Russia likes that. And we see a strong alignment with this message in Russian discourse and official documents, including the 2023 joint statement. We see that it has been also echoed, and so Global Security Initiative has been quoted from and sort of bowed to on regional security forums and platforms, and SCO and BRICS is the go-to place where we go to look for this. And then we also see that beyond that, there's also GSI is being promoted on international fora as well. So it's not just something that is niche and is being kept within the BRICS kind of conversation. Now to the Civilization Initiative. Again, the nice thing about GCI is that you don't have to have a shared vision of human rights to be a legitimate member of the international system. You can have this relativism, you can have relativism on human rights. It is well known that one of China's messages is that collective human rights trump individual human rights, and the right to development is something that has to be considered as a top human right so rather than right to political participation, it is something that has to be reached first and delivered on first. Which, of course, means no dissent is a good thing in a country that's developing. But another thing is that it's got an inward-facing sort of side. Global Civilization Initiative promotes state and ethnic nationalism domestically. We are a civilization. We know something that others don't. And by the way, when I was reading Nina Khrushcheva's article, it came up, but from the Russian side. So, and I double-checked that the document. It's really there that Putin speaks of Russia more and more as a self-sufficient state civilization. And that even goes back to eliminating European culture, interestingly, from some of the public spaces. Not all, but some. She makes that point. So this is a quote from the document, from a joint statement of 2023, that there is no such thing as superior democracy, and the parties oppose the imposition of national values on others, the drawing of ideological lines, the hypocritical narrative of so-called democracy versus authoritarianism, and the use of democracy and freedom as pretexts and political tools for exerting pressure on other countries. The Russian Federation attaches great importance to the Global Civilization Initiative proposed by China. Now, has that always been the case? No. China scholars, including myself, have argued that Russia does not like to spotlight BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, because of its own Eurasian Economic Union. It does not, and I think it's not actually, Russia is not officially a signatory to BRI. It is just included through the Eurasian Economic Union. So there was always, at least in the discursive field, there was kind of a reluctance to include these. We have our own words for these things. Thank you very much, was the approach. And of course, that also relies on the historic narrative that Russia had this ideological primacy. You would have this idea of coming to help of Chinese communists after 1949 and providing them with specialists, with technology. And so, but there was a small shift before Russia's full-scale attack, was that Xi Jinping's ideas were suddenly shown as compatible with Russia's worldview. So we are not quoting them, but we see the point and we don't disagree, was the message. Whereas now we've entered the phase where Russia is directly adopting Chinese rhetoric on these three initiatives. I'm not going to go beyond that because I'm sure that you can also make a point on some other things, such as the joint community for the future of mankind and things like that, that maybe it's not necessarily fully there. So there is something going on. It certainly does, I think, point towards Jean's conclusion that there is this, the asymmetry is certainly there. It's deepening. I wonder where is it going to lead us? Thanks.
Okay, we have about half an hour for discussion. And so we'll start off with some questions here from the in-person audience, and then after we'll take a round of questions, and then after that we'll take some questions from the online audience. So, yes, sir. Please.
Recently, I attended the speech that Sergei Radchenko gave on his book To Run the World on the Cold War relationship between Soviet Union and the West. And he said two interesting things. One was that at Yalta in 1945, Stalin really did believe that dominating Europe was the Soviet Union's destiny, and it was the price of victory. And he said that Putin is obsessed with Yalta, and it was become part of his. Now, that when Jean was talking about Russian hostility to the EU. And that goes back to the opposition to the Marshall Plan. I'm just wondering how much of that is still true today, that Putin and Russia believes it should dominate Europe. And second, but that is contradicted in some ways by the statement in Nina Khrushchev's article that you cite, which basically says we should kick European civilization out of public spaces in Russia. So I'm just wondering, what is Putin's Yalta vision, if you like, because we're coming back to that under Trump, and what space does that leave for the EU, is my question.
Okay, should we go ahead and take another couple of questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
Thanks. Another great panel. Thank you very much. I think my question is most aligned with Jean's presentation, but this could be for anyone on the panel. And it's to ask how you think the Chinese have managed to navigate the sanctions placed on Russia so well, whether they're happy about that, and whether that has any bearing on how the West more generally is engaging with China post February 2022. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to ask Professor Dudkiewicz to comment on, at least briefly, Russia's real military capacity in Ukraine with regards to news on North Koreans, some Chinese even, some Yemenites beefing up, as it were, the Russian military actions in Ukraine. And the second question I'd like to ask, and I'm very glad that the China hands are still here, could you comment on the viability of each regime, of Russia and China at this point in time? China's in particular, though not only.
Military regime? Just political regime? I don't know.
Did you get the?
I didn't quite catch that last.
The second question, if you could repeat it,
The
please.
second question to the entire panel, or both panels actually, the viability of the Putin regime on the one hand and of the Xi Jinping regime on the other hand, the latter certainly being the embodiment of fascism in East Asia.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and take some answers to these questions, and we'll just go down the lines here, starting with Piotr.
Putin's obsession. I understand, Jeremy, this is the shorthand for concert of great powers. The great powers should sit down and finally agree on the principles of the new order. And that is definitely in Putin's mind. And the war in Ukraine is a consequence of this thinking. Because by the war of Ukraine, Putin feels that Russia is liberated from any international obligations and can enter its own vision of the international order. We like it or not, this is the case. Whether this is feasible at this moment, I am not sure, but judging by what Trump is doing in connection to Russia, it seems to me that U.S. administration is not rejecting the idea of having a deal with Russia which will nullify the Russian status of non-handshaking nation. So that's at least my sense. So, and in this context, the war in Ukraine is facilitating rather than contradicting the idea of the sit-down and great power orders should be discussed again. That's one. About Russian sanctions, the sanctions against Russia. China is very cautious about those sanctions. It's helping Russia in many, many, many ways. But as far as W's components, it's pretty cautiously approaching, sending those goods indirectly, not through Russia recently, with a bigger cost than usual. So this is I see this as a cautious approach. In case of military capacity, this is a long answer and tragic answer, to me at least, because I am known as those who build bridges between Russia and Canada, and the war made these bridges no longer existing. But at the same time, I think, and I spoke with my students for the last 2 years, that Russia has all the capacities to military push Ukrainian forces back to the edge of Kiev, with or without China, with or without North Korea.
I'd say part of those questions are really hard to answer. Again, I would have been somebody that would have argued that with respect to Russian aspirations, should they dominate Europe? If you'd asked me that 3 years ago, I would have said, no, of course not. They seek a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. Medvedev referred to it in one of his talks as a region of privileged interest. And I do think they seek a sphere of influence in the Soviet space. Thinking back about, thinking back about what Russian goals are beyond that, I question, again, if you have an economy that is 1/9 the size of that of China, do they have and who knows what the do they really have the military capabilities, or I don't know. I mean, I think I have very traditional ideas too that a war in Europe is unthinkable, and I could be wrong about that as well. About the business about Europe, though, I mean, I can't remember how that came up, but and what Una had to her quote, that we're getting rid of European monuments or whatever because we're not European anymore. I mean, I've been reading Putin's speeches, which is of course fascinating, and he's gone on though in those speeches about how actually we are more European than the Europeans, because we exemplify the values that decadent Europe, with their LGBTQ and heaven knows what, are embracing, but we stand for the church, the family, et cetera, et cetera. On the sanctions, how does China, I don't have anything really much to say that Piotr doesn't say. The Chinese have been very careful not to formally invoke U.S. Or European criticism. I mean, they've been. I would also say that it's also complicated because if you look at the trade figures of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they've just skyrocketed. Now, what's going on? European goods are going to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and then onward to Russia. So some of the dual-use technology that is making its way to the Russian military is not necessarily from China. I mean, it could be from Turkey too, absolutely. But it can be, it can be German high-tech something or other that is being used in various sort of adapted to the Russian military. The viability of Xi and Putin. I will say one thing though about that. I mean, somebody pointed out this morning that Xi has no successor, and there he is, and that seems to be. But one thing, whether it works or not, Xi is a really big advocate of the Communist Party. I mean, when Putin dies, what is the outcome? When Xi dies, there is a party apparatus, and he's always talking about how important it is, and never forget party leadership or something. So I would put my bets on the Chinese rather than the Russians on that one.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's been largely covered. I just have two postscriptums here. First of all, on the European civilization out of public spaces, obviously it's a contradiction. I mean, Russia is built on many of these tenets. How do you take St. Petersburg out of St. Petersburg? But so the solution is exactly as Jean said, is we invented it first. Actually, when I was going over through some Russian analytical documents, I found a colleague very convincingly proven that the idea of the shared destiny for mankind can first be found in the 12th century Prince of Vladimir Suzdalski is something. And then, of course, Lenin spoke about it too. So big news. So the story is also about we are just as good. That's, we can make our own mozzarella. If you remember, 2014 was the response to European sanctions. And now on China's soldiers, it is my understanding that there is a qualitative difference between the North Korean soldiers and the Chinese. It is my understanding that the Chinese soldiers are not a regime export. They largely come in through recruiters individually, anecdotally unproven, maybe crossing the border in the north out of Dongbei. And there is a Chinese journalist. She's now a video blogger, and she's largely she's outside of China. She's largely watched among the overseas Chinese community, but also in China through VPNs and such. And she sat down. She had Zoom interviews with several Chinese soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine. And their stories were, of course, that we had no idea. And they actually did not, unlike the ones interviewed by the Ukrainians, they did not deny saying that they knew that they were signing up to fight, right? So they did not say, oh, I went there to work as an au pair and suddenly here I am, in Ukraine. But they did say that, of course, they haven't seen any money promised to them. And they did express some fear from the Chinese regime of retaliation over them doing this. So they did feel like they're doing something that, strictly speaking, is not allowed for a Chinese citizen. So I would say we shouldn't miss that difference of the armed forces there. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the online audience? No, not at the time? Okay, great. So we have some time for some additional questions? Sure.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm Vismay, a master's student at NIPSIA, Carleton University, studying security and defense policy. So I guess my question is more on the Arctic. I think we haven't touched upon, in the entire panels, we haven't touched upon the Arctic. So EU, Russia, and China, or Russia and China specifically, they have been investing in the Yamal LNG pipeline or the gas terminal in the Arctic. Have you seen anything from the Russian media, Chinese media, on the collaboration or perhaps continuation of enhanced collaboration in the Arctic that can potentially give them a shorter route to Rotterdam rather than going from Suez Canal, which could be complicated with the tensions in the Middle East? So thank you.
Okay. Karina.
My question might be a bit speculative, but we speak about post-2022 and the rapprochement between Russia and China. How do you see post-2025 and the U.S. role in this relationship, given that we see more closure towards Russia, but a push away of China? So what's the role of the U.S. in this relationship?
Okay. Any other questions? In the back.
Thank you for your conference. My question is for a whole panel. Considering the undeniable high Russian influence over Central Asia, today this is still continuing through initiatives like CSTO and Eurasian Economic Union. Meanwhile, the EU is also accelerating its influence. For example, recently, just like a few days ago, most of the Central Asian Turkic countries accepted the independent status of Republic of Cyprus, despite their good relations with Turkey. And China is also accelerating its influence through BRI initiative. So would you expect a kind of confrontation between Russia, EU, and China over Central Asia? Thank you.
Great. I think we'll go maybe in the reverse order this time. So we'll start with Una and come back this direction at the table.
Did not see that coming. Okay. Yeah. So Arctic. In fact, for China, the Arctic is one of the new strategic frontiers, and that's in the documents along with global commons, other global commons such as space, such as deep seas. There's, I think, five of them, and I think AI and the high-tech space is also one of these domains. The trick with Arctic is, if you look at that list, the Arctic is the only domain which actually does have some sovereignty over it, and and this is where the debate starts. We actually just spoke about this during a conference in Paris with some of my colleagues. Is on one hand, you see a lot of investment coming in. You see China becoming a player economically, and you do see that some domains that are given to them against the statements that took place 10 years ago from Russia. So we will never do A, and now they're doing A. On the other hand, it's very clear that the Arctic is, of course, for China is a shipping route, yes, but for Russia it is a security domain. So you have all these beautiful, nice security towns with cute names like Snowflake that are basically part of the highest level of security for the state. So I don't know. I'm in the team that says, to an extent, China will be let in there, but Russia is watching, and I think Pyotr's presentation also outlines it very well. There's a lot of anxiety over I'm not a Russia scholar, by the way, so don't listen to me, but it's just my feeling. Now, Russia-China post-2025, I don't believe in a reverse Nixon because, and yeah, I'm one of the people again who don't believe in that because I think Putin will wear out Trump's patience pretty quickly, and we already see these signs. Of course, we do have a very sad news today again that the G7 statement on Sumi didn't pass because of the U.S. not wanting to sign it. But that again is quite Trump-esque. So I think in the long run, it will pretty much remain as is for the time being. And Central Asia, I'm sorry, I may have not gotten all of the keywords of your question, so I'm just going to steal it away from you and say that one thing that is coming up really strongly with post-2025 is that the EU has really woken up to Central Asia. Again, we see this heightened level, we see the representation. I know this because the Balts have been traditionally involved with Central Asia, kind of saw it as their portfolio within the EU. So there is, I think, the region, how Greenland said, oh, finally we're noticed, at least one good thing come out of it. And then I think for Central Asia, it's another thing that's going to come out of it. There's going to be an even bigger presence and interest of these players there. Thank you. How did I do?
You did great. I am no authority on the Arctic, and I don't know about the pipeline. I think I might have vaguely read something a week or so ago about it, but I can't speak to it. What I do know is that there is allegedly Russian-Chinese cooperation in the Arctic, but I think that the Russians are very territorial about preserving their control over that region, and China is kind of a grudging accompaniment, but China has the money that the Russians don't have. Post-2025 Russia-U.S., who knows, right? It's a great question. And I think also it depends on, if I were Putin, although I think he's a risk taker, there happens to be a bigger global world risk taker these days who's dominating the world stage. And I would be wary of getting involved in a deal with Trump because 6 weeks later, he could turn his back on you. And then what would you be? I do worry that he's going to cut a deal with Russia about Ukraine that will involve significant territorial annexations, and that might happen before all of this. And I also feel quite confident that in the Trump world, Russia's not a threat, China's a threat. So I guess take what you might with that and what that means and the extent to which I think American foreign policy will be oriented more toward being conciliatory toward Russia than it will be toward China. And I don't think, as somebody else said this morning, I don't think Trump doesn't care about the Europeans. He doesn't care about the Ukrainians, so there we are. He might be the real Stalin at Yalta kind of person in the spheres of influence and the carving the world up into different spheres. But on Central Asia, I have been working on Central Asia, so I can talk to that a little bit more. I guess, the EU came last week to Central Asia. They signed a strategic partnership, I guess. But they've been talking for years about coming to Central Asia, right? And what do they actually do? Although they do seem to be serious about the trade, the middle corridor. path. And that would be, I think, very helpful for Central Asia. But in terms of Russia and China and Central Asia, every once in a while, in their joint statements about what I said about coordination, they say we coordinate our policies on Central Asia, and they have never yet given an example of what that might be. And I think a very telling sort of incidence of the lack of coordination on Central Asia is that it was 23 or 24, China held a conference. It invited all of the leaders of Central Asia. They came to Xi'an. They had a lovely time talking about the historical similarities between the Silk Road and, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, where was Russia? Where was Russia, their coordinate partner in all of this? They weren't invited. And I think that says something about that whole relationship with, and I think the Russians are, in my opinion, you read a lot about this, and most people say that they get along just fine, China and Russia, with respect to their interest in Central Asia, and I think they do have some very important overlapping interests like terrorism and stability in the region, but the bottom line is that the Chinese influence in Central Asia is not just through the BRI. It's much more multifaceted than that, and that's something to think about for the future.
Thank you. Arctic. To answer your question, Russia would like China to be involved in this gas project. But so far, China did not make any serious commitments. But maybe it will happen. My understanding is that China is building capacity in two directions. First, in expert capacity to understand Arctic. And I participated, invited by Chinese, to one of the conferences. It was 16 centers of Arctic studies in China, which I calculated quickly, and they have three times more people working on Arctic than Canada. And so this is one, building expert capacity and policy capacity. And the second leg is in building the transportation capacity. Icebreakers, they have more icebreakers than Canada has, and building 7 more. And also building the fleet, which is up to the Arctic standards that is given by the Arctic Council, means to have a double hull, yes, and so on and so forth, special navigation and rescue capacity as well. And also, these Chinese are not only active with Russia; they are very active with Norway. They have a very good connection with the Fyodor Nansen Institute, which is the leading institute of studying Arctic. And they have a permanent presence over there. At the same time, Norwegian scholars, they have permanent presence in the in the Chinese Academy of Science. So there are multifaceted contacts in this regard. They are not involved in any Russian projects of militarization of Arctic whatsoever. In the rescue aspect, when the Russian military will play certain roles, they are involved. So that's this question. As far as a Krina question, 2025, this beautiful question for any political scientist. No responsibility, we can dream on. My sense in this area is that Russia will be quite close to US because Russia will give using Trump words, wonderful, beautiful opportunity for US in the area of gas and oil, and it will be very soon. Russian new ambassador to US, Darchiev, is there not because of Ukraine conflict and negotiation with the United States, but because of bilateral relations with the U.S. So the big deal is coming. Whether this big deal will be somehow permanent or semi-permanent, very hard to say. But the idea of having Russia and U.S. Involved in certain large-scale economic project for the sake of security is in the both heads, both Russian and American heads. That is my sense. And judging by what they have done recently in conversation in Oman, is the clear example that Ukraine is on the back bench. The most important are now bilateral relations. So that's about this dreaming on. In Central Asia, the Central Asian countries are building their own identity, and it will show up very soon. More independent from China and more independent from Russia. However, EU presence is negligent, it's conversation, and in many cases related to EU, blah, blah, and nothing more than that. Then US rather not involved, but the Eurasian Economic Union is a real instrument for bringing some influence of Russia into Central Asia because of the common labor market and common commodity market. This is important for them and for Russia, and that will be my sense of the future. But I agree with what my colleague said, so I will not take more of the time.
Okay, I think that's all the time that we have for the session, but please join me in thanking our guests for sharing their expertise with us today.